Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the COVID-19 and Youth Employment webinar that is being organized by the United Nations Academic Impact. For those of you who do not know about us, this is an initiative that aligns institutions of higher education and research centers, as well as think tanks, with the goals and principles and mandates of the United Nations. And this is of particular relevance, not only because we are within the framework of the Decade of Action for the SDGs that was proclaimed by the United Nations since last year. Seems so close, and yet there's so much to do before reaching the deadline of the year 2030 to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But also because we are, of course, within a framework of a global pandemic with so many challenges and so many people that have been affected. And among those people of particular interest for us as the UN Academic Impact is, of course, the youth. And today, within the framework of the World Youth Skills Day, it is a remarkable opportunity to discuss a little bit about not only what has happened with the youth in terms of employment within this global crisis that has such a tremendous socioeconomic impact around the world, particularly in the developing world, but also at a very global scale. And it seems that there's no light at the end of the tunnel. And yet the youth is not only one of the most affected components of the human population that have been affected, but also is probably is where the solution relies. So when we discuss about youth employment, training, vocational training, decent jobs for the youth, I think this is an opportunity for us to discuss, to share best practices, and also to share, if I may say so, to share some hope regarding this. So it is my privilege to be here with you and to share and to hear from the experts from multilateral institutions, but also from universities that are here with us and think tanks that they will share their knowledge, expertise, angles, and views regarding the topic of youth employment within the framework if hopefully the post-COVID-19 situation around the world. And with that, I will give the floor back to Tess.
Thank you, Omar, for that introduction. And thank you again for everyone for joining us and to our distinguished panelists. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. As introduced, my name is Tess Westbrook, and I'm a representative of the UN Academic Impact, and I will be your moderator today. Just a reminder to all of our guests to remain muted with your cameras off, and speakers, please, if you could also be muted when not speaking, and keep your introductory comments to around 5 minutes. The audience may submit questions at any time during the webinar in the chat box, and the speakers will get a chance to answer and discuss more in depth during the moderated discussion, which will happen after all of the speakers have been able to introduce themselves. So without further ado, our first speaker today is Mr. Cher Verick. Cher is the head of the Employment Strategies Unit in the Employment, Labour Markets and Youth Branch at the International Labour Organization. He has also worked in employment policy and with the UN Economic Commission for Africa. He is here to start off the discussion, so please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Tess, and thanks to the UNAI for this opportunity. It's on an important day, and we're discussing a very important topic. Let me start with a few points that come from the work we've been doing at the ILO in terms of looking at the global impact of the COVID-19 crisis. I'll start by stressing what I think we all know is that the COVID-19 crisis has disproportionately affected young people. According to our global estimates, we see that young people's employment declined by 8.7% in 2020 compared with 3.7% last year. And I would also point out that the declines for young people in the labour market have been much greater in middle-income countries, and this is because of the strict lockdowns that have been in those places, and also the nature of the labour market. In particular, the high levels of informality, and the weaker policy support that is there to help businesses and workers. A second point I would also highlight in terms of the global impact is that in this crisis, young women have been hit harder, which reflects their overrepresentation in those badly affected service sectors, in particular hospitality and others where young women have a higher representation. And a third point I would also underscore is that normally we see during a crisis, and of course we saw this during the global financial crisis, that job losses and you know the stopping of hiring in the labour market leads to an increase in unemployment. Actually, you know, an important outcome in this crisis has been that the job losses have actually resulted in rising inactivity, because during the lockdown periods, young people have not been able to undertake job search and be available for work. So they've actually been withdrawing from the labour force. And this is a real concern because of the longer term consequences. And, you know, in relation to that, we've also seen in many countries a rise in the NEET rate. That is the share of young people who are not in employment, education or training. And this is something that policymakers really need to be concerned about. And then when, you know, we're looking at where we are now in terms of the impact of the crisis, how the lockdown measures continue to affect us, you know, we're still very much in the midst of this crisis, as we all know. We did see some signs of recovery in certain economies and labour markets at the end of 2020 as countries had lifted lockdown measures, in particular in advanced economies. And we saw some recovery in youth employment in those labour markets. But we also see that recovery has stalled in many of them, has even reversed in some. And we see it, you know, not progressing in particularly in those hard hit middle income countries that I mentioned before, that in, you know, let's say in Latin America, where the falls in youth employment have been the greatest. You know, and so the bottom line is that the recovery for youth in the labour market remains very much incomplete. It's fragile, it's uncertain, and definitely is uneven also across countries and within countries, also looking at the different types of young people, the most vulnerable, particularly those with low levels of education. So that's a few insights I wanted to share on the global impact. Of course, the big question is what needs to be done in response to this situation. You know, of course, the overall broad level of support to the economy and the labour market remains absolutely essential. And, you know, you've seen, you know, unprecedented levels of macroeconomic stimulus in 2020 and also, you know, in advanced economies in 2021. You know, and another obvious step that we all need to have happen for economies to recover and the labour market to recover is the vaccination rollout, and both the stimulus part and also the vaccination rollout are major challenges in developing countries where the fiscal capacity and the the setup is not as well established to achieve those goals. But beyond the broader goals of the health aspects and also the macroeconomic stimulus, as we know, it's absolutely essential to look at measures that also target young people. Through integrated employment policies that look at both, measures that support the hiring of young people, getting them the right skills, supporting them, making those transitions in the labour market as we move into recovery. And this is going to be really important moving forward, where we will need to look at where the job opportunities are, right? So, some sectors, as I mentioned, have been hit much harder: hospitality, tourism, etc. And other sectors have continued to grow more robustly. As we enter recovery, we'll see a continuation of some of that unevenness in sectoral patterns. And it's really critical then that government employment policies recognize that and see how young people can get into certain sectors, and particularly those that are offering job opportunities. And really a critical part of that will be, targeting young women and, vulnerable young people, those with low levels of education, etc., through those types of policies and services. And finally, I would just stress, of course, there are overall issues about the protection of young people in the labour market and their rights and their participation also in this process. That is absolutely critical, that I would also like to highlight. So that's the points that I wanted to share with you. And thanks again, Tess, for this opportunity.
No, thank you so much for starting us off so well and for introducing the topic in a more broader sense. And I think one of the most important points that you brought up there is that not every sector, not every type of person, not every country has been affected in the same way. And I think that's important to note going forward, that even though we're talking broadly about COVID-19 and youth employment, it is a very nuanced subject, obviously. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you starting us off. So next up, we have Mr. Mohammed Shah, who is the director of the National Incubation Center at Quetta in the Belarusian University of Information Technology, Engineering and Management Sciences in Pakistan. This incubator is the first and only of its kind in the country and champions a public-private partnership to encourage entrepreneurship among young people. Additionally, Butem's university is actually UN Academic Impact's SDG hub for Goal 8, Decent Work and economic growth. So please take it away. Sorry, you're muted, Mohammed. Thank you.
Thank you, Tess, and hello, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar. I would like to build on what my friend Sher already pointed out, that according to this recent ILO report, the global unemployment figure will cross 200 million people in the year 2022, with, of course, women and youth hardly hit, as Sher pointed out. And it goes without saying that the ongoing COVID pandemic would further contribute to this crisis. Systematic problems like this one need systematic and sustained solutions. And in my opinion, one way to alleviate this crisis is to not rely on the traditional way of job creation anymore. What I'm referring to is that universities around the globe have a role to play. And I think universities need to produce more and more job creators rather than job seekers. And they can do it by actively fostering innovation and entrepreneurial activities on campuses. On the other hand, I'm also of the opinion that entrepreneurial ability of university students and faculty to create new products and services and hence employment is very, very central to global recovery. This is especially true in this current scenario where so many lives are turned upside down and millions of jobs are destroyed. It's very pertinent to quote John Keynes, one of the leading economists here, who said that the more unstable the parameters in the world, the more the insights and intuition of the entrepreneur matter. Having said this, let me state here that more and more universities around the world have already started offering a range of facilities and programs to encourage entrepreneurial endeavors of students and faculty. In addition to the entrepreneurship courses that are being taught in the universities, several universities around the globe have set up various facilities and programs, including incubators, accelerators, invention rooms, maker spaces, wet labs, and digital observatories to create a vibrant ecosystem within the campuses. I will share an example which will give you an idea of what's happening in universities around the world. In the year 2020 alone, the 10 most innovative universities in the US produced more than 8,000 startups that in turn raised a cumulative capital of $60 billion US. So as Tess said that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Pakistan, let me come to my home country, Pakistan. Pakistan has already started joining the trend. As you may know that Pakistan is one of the largest young country in the world. We have 64% of our population under the age of 30. In other words, there are more than 51 million 15 to 30-year-olds in Pakistan today. This youth bulge, which is usually referred to, this youth bulge has the potential to be a dividend for the country, or it can turn out to be a catastrophe if not managed properly. The unemployment rate among this age group is already at 8.5%. This is according to a UNDP report, which is amongst the highest in the region. According to another UNDP report, Pakistan needs to create an additional 1.3 million jobs every year for the next 5 years to improve labor force participation rates in the country. And I think this has been a problem for other countries also, like Sher pointed out. Government or any other entity for that matter may not be able to create these many jobs. In my opinion, intensifying innovation and entrepreneurial activity may be the only way to create this number of jobs. To support this claim, let me share with you that National Incubation Center Quetta, which I'm heading, which is an incubator housed in Bhutan's University, like Tess said in the introduction. This NIC Quetta, alongside 4 other sister national incubation centers, which are set up in other regions of Pakistan. These 5 NICs have produced 225 startup companies within the past 5 years. And these 225 startup companies have cumulatively created 38,000 plus jobs and have generated a cumulative investment of 4.8 billion Pakistani rupees, which are equivalent to $30 million US. To sum it up, I believe that collaborative platforms like university incubators and accelerators need to be developed in universities across the globe to foster entrepreneurial mindset and promote startup culture if we are to tackle the alarming global unemployment rates. As you also know that the pandemic has hit universities also. So I would like to conclude by saying that amongst all the difficulties universities currently face, they must strive to prepare students for the uncertain and unpredictable world by inculcating entrepreneurial mindset in students. This is how universities can fulfill their important role in changing the foundations of society and the economy at large. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that comment. And it's very interesting, the fact you laid out a case study to kind of give some numbers and some perspective to what actually is going on, and also to kind of point to some solutions and begin thinking about the future and how we can tackle such problems. I had no idea that such a large portion of the population in Pakistan were young people. So it's really reassuring to hear that people like yourself are working actively to make sure that young people are prepared going forward, and if there are no jobs for them, they can just create a job. And I think that's a really interesting creative strategy moving forward. So thank you for your comments, and hopefully we can talk about it further in the discussion. So our next speaker this morning is Azita Berar Awad, who is the founder of the Global Network of Policy Research on Youth Transitions. She is also the chair of the board of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Policy and the director of policy at the Global Labour Organization. She is the former director of the ILO Employment Policy Department, and she was the lead of the ILO Global Call for Action on Youth Employment Crisis in 2012, which called for targeted and urgent action on the youth employment crisis. She has also worked on the initiator of the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth, which was a multi-stakeholder coalition in 2016. So, Azita, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tess, for organizing this webinar on this very important topic, and to UNAI for gathering the fellow colleagues and panelists on this important occasion of the Skills Day. I would like to make briefly 3 points building on what has been said already. First of all, let us remember that this is the second crisis in a little over 10 years that youth are impacted massively and in a disproportionate manner. What do we mean by disproportionate manner? If we compare it relative to their weight in population, but also relative to their weight in any category that they are, whether we are looking at youth in informal employment, whether we are looking at youth in tertiary education, whether we are looking at youth in formal sector, and the impact has been staggering, massive, and unprecedented. The first time this happened in the aftermath of the 2007-8 global financial crisis, there was a kind of surprise and unexpected at these staggering numbers, and that the disproportionate impact had become something systemic. Youth actually labor markets had not recovered from the first fully recovered from the first crisis that we had, unfortunately, this massive crisis of COVID-19, which is, as everybody says, like crisis like no other, which has impacted this time not only the job market, but also if we look at the very sensitive process of school to work transition, that it has impacted both sides of the equation. On the impacted education, with school closures, with digital divide and non-access to digital means of continuing schooling. And it has affected the jobs, and it has affected not only the temporary jobs that students have regularly access to finance their studies while they are studying, but also as they enter for a more permanent solutions in the labor market. And any aspect of this transition is being researched across the world, including by those who are members of, you mentioned the Global Network of Policy Research on Youth Transitions, and the stories that we are collecting and data evidence that we are collecting also at the micro level shows that the staggering impact. But let me mention, while we are in the context of looking with UNAI at tertiary education, let us remember that actually many young people do transit from school to work, not necessarily at the tertiary level, but they leave school sometimes too early, at the end of the primary school or at the end of intermediate school. So that these different stages and pathways of transitions from school to work are all impacted in one way or another by the impact of COVID. And what I really want to point to is that there are very few mechanisms of support in the rescue and recovery programs that have been put in around the world. All kinds of countries, developing, low income, middle income, advanced countries, have come with massive rescue and recovery packages, whether focusing through labor market institutions such as work sharing arrangements, unemployment subsidies, subsidies to SMEs, but also in a lot of developing countries through anti-poverty programs, through public works programs, but none of them really target and none of them really adequately responds to this sensitive transition process from school to work, which is impacted massively by crisis. And if we consider that crises are going to recur, unfortunately, we really need to think of major policy innovation in the area of support to youth groups in their very sensitive stage of transition from to school to work. And I can elaborate further on what can come into these policy packages, but policies matter. And we have seen that lack of policies also matter in the sense that youth, the impact of COVID on youth should be seen within the broader context of inequalities, of rising inequalities, as we have said, and youth has come to emerge as an important issue for policy focus if we are going to tackle inequalities in a broader sense. But also a point that has to be emphasized is that youth, you mentioned the tests are not also equal. So there is a big divide in equal access to equal opportunities and access to equal outcomes. And therefore, we should be also mindful that the crisis impacts inequalities and within the youth group. And actually, if we have already enough data from the first crisis, the 2007-8 crisis, but also the data emerging from the current crisis shows that youth who are not a homogeneous group, but also polarization increases as a result of the impact of crisis. So therefore, the rescue and remedy should be instantaneous, should be systematic, and should avoid that these polarization have staggering impact in the future. But I would just for 30 seconds also want to, as Omar Hernandez also mentioned, underscore also a positive note, because we are seeing tremendous stories of youth agency in coming up with coping strategies, in solidarity amongst themselves, but also in broader solidarity in support to communities where they are. So I really want that to highlight the youth agency and youth initiatives and youth solidarity groups that have been emerging as a result or in response to the crisis.
Thank you so much, and thank you for ending on a positive note. That's always a good thing to finish up on. And I think you brought up two really important points that maybe haven't been addressed yet, is the fact that this generation of young people, this is not their first economic crisis that they have lived through, this is their second. And so it's really interesting to see the comparisons from last time to this time, and I think hopefully we'll discuss a little bit more about that change among the young people from the first crisis to the second. And also the impact on education. Obviously, we're talking about employment here, but a lot of the times one goes hand in hand with the other, and that transition is so important. And as you mentioned, it's been incredibly disruptive, the COVID-19 pandemic, both on education and employment, and then that link between education and employment. And so again, hopefully that is something we can discuss further, because I'm sure a lot of people are interested in how we can strengthen that link, especially during times of crisis. So thank you. Our next speaker up today is Dr. Nader Kabani, who is the Director of Research at the Brookings Data Center and also a Senior Research Fellow at the same institute. He's the Director of Policy and Research at the Silatech Foundation and the Founding Director of the Syrian Development Research Center. He has authored multiple relevant policy papers to this topic, including one titled Youth Employment in the Middle East and North Africa, Revisiting and Reframing the Challenge. So Nader, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tess, so much, and many thanks to you and Academic Impact for putting together this excellent webinar and workshop. So I think I'm going to reflect on 3 key points, and some of it kind of covers ground initially that was covered by others, Shara and Azita. So the first thing we know is that the pandemic really impacted young people, and it disrupted employment for both young people and adults. However, young people who are still in school or just leaving school were disproportionately affected, as Azita emphasized. And Chair mentioned the recent ILO study that found that in 2000, youth employment dropped by 8.7% as compared to 3.7% among adults, so more than twice. But to a large extent, this is to be expected. I mean, young people are still in school, and their education was disrupted, their taking exams was disrupted. And as they left school to look for jobs, they're the ones most likely going to be impacted by the lack of opportunities, the kind of lockdowns, and have this difficulty in terms of finding employment. So, with the exception of a few sectors, also when they first get to a job, when the pandemic hit, they had limited ability to interact with others in the workplace, limited ability to get on the job training and learning. So really, it's not a surprise that youth in this school to work transition were affected, and will be affected by other kinds of disruptions. Some new opportunities emerged, including positions in tech sectors, positions in health and certain service sectors. But by and large, we need to think about this transition as being disrupted. A second key point to emphasize is that the pandemic really exacerbated inequalities. So it had a greater impact on young women, as Cher mentioned. So the ILO study found that employment fell by 13.9% for young women, as compared to 11.2% for young men. The pandemic also exacerbated pre-existing inequalities within countries and between countries. Because within countries you have urban centers that have better access to better quality education, more decent job opportunities, better internet connections. And the same can be applied to between countries, where some countries are more developed and advanced and have better infrastructure and education institutions and job opportunities than poorer countries and more developing countries. So the pandemic really showed some of these fault lines, and this has broad implications in terms of access to communication, information technology, access to platforms where young people can interact online, capacity of teachers and their training, capacity of institutions to use technology effectively and whether they're connected or not, and very quickly the ability of institutions to adapt to their changing circumstances. So this is important because Azita mentioned that this is not just the first crisis we faced in the past 10 years, it's the second that has impacted young people, and we're likely to see different ones in the future, either through or through other health, other pandemics. So we need to take lessons of this crisis hard and figure out what we can do differently. How can we incorporate greater resiliency and ability among young people and our institutions to respond? So I have kind of 3 ideas about this. The first thing is to note that the countries and institutions that were able to respond effectively to this pandemic can you hear me?
Hi, Nadar, we can hear you. Your video has, oh, you're back. Maybe if you turn off your video, it might be stronger. Hello, can you hear me okay? I apologize. We appear to have lost Nadar. Oh, he's back.
Hello?
Hello.
Sorry about that. I'm sorry
no
about that.
problem at all.
When did I drop off?
Maybe about 2 minutes ago, you were just about to start your 3 points.
I was about to start the 3 points. Wow, I actually kept going without realizing I had dropped off. I'm sorry about that.
You powered through, no problem at all.
I will keep it short then. So the first point was basically emphasizing the fact that the pandemic really impacted young people disproportionately, as Azita mentioned, and I was mentioning that this is to be expected because really, I mean, young people are in a transition from school to work, so their education was affected, their exams were disrupted. When they started looking for work, there were lockdowns and they weren't able to access these job opportunities. Firms weren't hiring. Even those who made a transition before the pandemic didn't really get to engage with their colleagues in the workspace, didn't get on-the-job training or learning as much as they should have. So it's not surprising that young people's transitions were affected. They were in transition as compared to adults. And as a result, just to mention the ILO study that Cher mentioned, youth employment dropped by 8.7% in 2000 as compared to 3.7% among adults. The second point was that the pandemic really exacerbated inequalities. We already mentioned that there was a greater impact on young women. So the ILO study found that employment fell for young women by 13.9% as compared to 11.2% for young men. The pandemic also exacerbated pre-existing inequalities within countries and between countries. So in terms of access to education, in terms of decent jobs, once you have differences within countries, urban centers are more likely to have good opportunities in terms of employment. They have better institutions in terms of education, and they're more connected to the internet, to the global economy, and so they're more resilient than peripheries within these countries and rural areas. Same thing within countries. Countries that have more resources, are more developed, have the ability to withstand these kinds of disruptions as compared to poorer countries and developing countries who don't necessarily have the same access to communication, information technology, broadband. Teachers' capacities are weaker, and technology isn't integrated into the schools. So this is important because Azita mentioned that this is the second major crisis we faced in the past 10 years that's disrupted youth transitions, and we're likely to face similar crises in the future from let's say climate change or from another pandemic, God forbid, or things like this. So we need to take the lessons of this pandemic to heart. And so what are some of the lessons? The first lesson is that the countries and organizations and institutions that were able to respond effectively to this pandemic, to summarize it, they basically took the situation seriously and they looked for ways for dealing with it. Not all countries that successfully handled the pandemic dealt with it in the same way. New Zealand really locked down and closed off the country because they were an island. They were able to limit the spread of COVID to essentially, very, very few cases and control it. Other countries tried to find a way of living with it because they were much more integrated, but essentially kind of balanced out the closures and the lockdowns with the rise and fall of the cases. And then prepared for rollout of the vaccines when that happened. So basically taking it seriously was very important, both at the country level and at the organizational level. The same needs to be said for the coming trends. The second key point is youth skills really are important. And we're talking about the Youth Skills Day. So what kind of skills are we talking about? Young people with technical skills were able to access online platforms, either through in terms of starting businesses or entrepreneurial activities, or engaging with freelance platforms, or in terms of education. Those that were comfortable with using technology were better able to succeed and navigate the school closures. The youth soft skills were very important. Critical thinking, analytical thinking was very important. Problem solving was very important. Young people who were able to say, okay, well, this is the situation. How do I deal with it? As opposed to just kind of waiting for something to happen, were the ones that were able to cope with the pandemic and develop better coping strategies. So that's very important. Also something that Azita mentioned is youth agency. Youth with a growth mindset, which has become popularized by the work of Carol Dweck. Youth who are seeking out experiences, who treat the pandemic it's a disruptive thing, but essentially try to work their way around it. Those were the young people who were able to really, find opportunities within this context. And in regions like the Middle East, this is very important. I mean, young people are dissuaded by their families from actually gaining work experience, exploring opportunities until they've completely finished their studies. So you end up with young people who come to the labor market. In Egypt, for example, over 80% of young people who start looking for a job and are unemployed did not have prior work experience at all. And these are the young people who are a big disadvantage when the situation changes and they can't get those jobs because they don't have any idea of how to navigate and how to deal with uncertainty. And so resilience really requires young people to have agency and to build agency within the context of their development and within the context of education systems. And finally, countries, organizations, and institutions that were, as I mentioned previously, that were flexible and adaptive, those were the ones who were able to really successfully, as much as possible, navigate the pandemic and potentially future crises. As opposed to countries, institutions, and organizations that had fairly rigid bureaucracies and weren't very adaptive. So schools, I mean, I've seen education schools that quickly responded, got technology infrastructure that already had it in place and were able to use it and leverage it and reach out to the children and readjust their programming and fix things so that the students were able to continue learning. Actually managed fairly well. So growth mindset doesn't just apply to individuals, it actually applies to organizations and institutions. And I think the future challenges really depend on having that kind of flexibility built in. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. And those were some really interesting points you brought up. And I think it's important to start learning from the lessons of COVID. And like you were saying, see what some countries and organizations and companies did well and how some people adapted in a positive way and how we can harness that kind of creativity moving forward. Because as you said, there are likely to be other crises, even if they're climate or pandemic or, as you said, touch wood, hopefully not one in the future. But it is something that is important to take forward. So thank you for starting to unpick that a little bit. And hopefully we can start talking a little bit more later about how to harness this flexibility and these skills and how to take them forward. So thank you very much for your comments. And finally, we have Dr. Golo Hinseke. who is an applied economist with a multidisciplinary social science background. He currently works at the Centre for Research on Learning and Life Chances at University College London Institute of Education as a research officer. And he is also currently the research officer and principal investigator of the project COVID-19, Youth Economic Activity and Health Monitor, which looks to address the UK's need for robust evidence on the pandemic's consequences for youth employment, learning and well-being. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Tess. It's great to be here. Fantastic panels. Really enjoyed so far all the contributions. And actually, my bit would kind of wrap it up by basically supporting everything that's been said before. So I've run this leadless project on youth employment, economic activity, well-being, and skills. So it's right at the intersection between all these aspects of how skills can help young people navigate this uncertain labor market. And we already heard how the pandemic has particularly affected youth, and the same has happened in the UK, where it's been especially youth employment that suffered as a result of the pandemic. We launched to learn better how young people, what resources young people have and how they can manage this uncertain labor market. We launched a survey in February 2021 and again in May 20 and following in May, a second wave. And what stood out to me are basically three things. First is the great worry about career prospects and job skills learning. There's a lot of discussion in the UK at the moment about education, lost education. It's of course very, very important, but what gets sometimes missed is the lost learning of job skills in this discussion. And we find that the majority of our students are worried that they lost out on job skills learning opportunities as a result of the pandemic. And it's especially pronounced among young people in education, which is not surprising given what we've heard so far. And this matters. It matters especially for their life satisfaction. Young people were at a particularly bad place in the UK when it comes to life satisfaction during the pandemic. It's not all bad. There's also great volatility. In other words, there's great dynamic. Life satisfaction changes very dynamically in this age group as the external circumstances change. And what we see is that it's actually as well this worry about career prospects and job skills learning that drives some of these changes. It's not only social isolation and the loss of social context, but as well these worries about the future. In fact, one thing we can see is that young people in our data do not need a reminder about scarring effects. They are very well aware of the consequences this pandemic can have on their job skills and future prospects. The second thing we looked at were some of the issues around what skills actually help young people. And we already heard a great deal about agency and resilience and as a means to foster resilience. And one of the facets we looked at was career readiness, career preparation. How much difference did actually prior career preparation made in how young people navigated this uncertain labor market? And in our findings, it seems like prior engagement with career development activities in school, such as doing an internship, doing a work experience placement, participating in business competition, all that could together help young people to navigate the labor market, to be more certain which direction to take in this period, as well to be more active in their job search when they find themselves in situation of need or in precarious work, and as well be more successful in their job hunt, and i.e. have higher chance of getting a recall from each of their applications they sent out. So what this it leaves me with is basically, I think, in order to looking forward, there needs to be a strengthening of this link, and we already talked about this link between education and work, and how especially this transition period is very needs to be managed carefully, or needs to be guided and supported. And one of the things we think could really help moving forward and in the future would be to better integrate this provision of career development activities with in this pathway, either through public policy or better engagement of education providers with employers and business people. And that's it.
That's great. Thank you so much. Very short and sweet. I appreciate it. But you brought up some really interesting points that I actually was going to question in a second. So that's great. Thank you. I do think this question of transition and how to best support it. And I mean, I've heard anecdotal stories from people about this worry and this feel like you've lost a career prospect or a period in your life that is so important to your transition from education to employment. And so I can only feel for people who are stressed about it and who are in this time. So I think thank you for bringing up that different perspective, because often it's all about the numbers and not necessarily about how people are feeling. So thank you very much, Doctor. So that comes to the end of our introductions, and after hearing from all of our speakers and getting a taste of the topic we are discussing today, we are going to now turn to the moderated discussion. So a reminder to all of our participants that you may submit questions at any time in the chat box. And to our speakers, I would ask, if possible, you can maybe turn on your cameras and maybe simply indicate raise a hand or just speak up if you are interested in answering any of the open questions, if one of the questions is not directed to a specific person. So please remain muted if you're not speaking as well. And again, to the audience, please remain muted with your cameras off. To start us off, I would like to also turn back to this idea of skills acquisition, entrepreneurship, career development, these kind of buzzwords, and how can we get organizations to support this difficult transition and these crucial skills that are being discussed today. And I know Dr. Hanseki kind of started to touch upon this, but I was wondering, perhaps, Mohammed, if you would like to start us off to speak a little bit more in depth about how your organization and entrepreneurship perhaps will help with this transition from education to employment and skills acquisition.
Yeah, thank you, Tess. Really insightful discussion. I'm really enjoying it. What I was referring to was two things. Since youngsters, especially those in the transition phase, as pointed out by Nadir, were hit the hardest by this pandemic. And so we need to equip the students with a different skill set so that they are prepared for crises like this pandemic. And I think fostering an entrepreneurial mindset will prepare students for the uncertain and unpredictable world. Because the courses that we teach here in our university, Butums, those entrepreneurship courses, students learn about analytical skills, organizational and interpersonal skills, design thinking, solving complex problems, calibrating risks, and effectively networking. And I think these are the kind of skills that will really go a long way in helping those students that find themselves in the kind of situation that we have right now to navigate smoothly. In addition to that, I think universities need to focus more and more on soft skills that in addition to the technical skills, we need to focus on the soft skills like emotional intelligence, like resilience. These kind of skills will really matter a lot in the near future. In fact, according to World Economic Forum Future of Work report, which was published a few months back, the top 3 skills that they identified were 1, complex problem solving, 2, critical thinking, and 3, creativity. 4 was the emotional intelligence. So I think we need to keep that in mind because the student who is enrolled in first year today would graduate 4 years from now. So we need to inculcate in students the skills that will help them 4 years down the road. And I think this emotional intelligence, creativity, critical thinking, these are the kind of skills that are evergreen. You know, these skills will help them in all kinds of situations. Thank you.
No, thank you for starting that off. Does anyone else have any follow-up comments to Mohammed's start of the discussion there? That's okay, we can move on. I would like to address a question to Azita. So you mentioned in your introduction about the first crisis that occurred in the 2007, 8, 9 period. What has changed for young people during the second crisis, and what perhaps has not changed, and what lessons can we learn from the first crisis going forward?
We sort of, from the first crisis, we sort of came to reckon that why youth were disproportionately, I mean, we asked many questions, disproportionately impacted. And then there were a number of initiatives that were put in practice. And there were also evaluations of these, whether they really redressed. But the bottom line is that, of course, this is a very, we need a more refined and context-specific discussion. But the bottom line was that, in fact, there was something systematically changing in labor markets. So it wasn't a case of, you know, a sporadic impact that needed, that could be redressed by a certain scheme that is improvised in response to the crisis. That something fundamentally had changed in school to work transition for young people compared to the previous generation, if you want to say, and that made that transition more difficult, more unstable, more insecure in terms of outcomes. Now, then the discussion while we are on the skills date focused on before the pandemic, on the future of work, the new wave of technologies, and therefore the need for continuous reskilling, upskilling, and education and skills was looked at in totally different light, not for having a tertiary education degree and then stopping, but continuous upgrading and upskilling. And there were very fundamental questions that are still there to be answered: how to finance, what is the role of public policy and private cooperation and partnership was one of the promising areas, but it hasn't been really matching the scale needed and the innovation needed. So upskilling and reskilling are very important, education, but also access, equality of opportunity of access to these training opportunities. However, in response to crises like the one we are living and like the one we really need, one of the lessons learned is that it's very difficult to improvise while you are in the middle of crisis in terms of response. You really need to have the mechanisms, the institutions in place, invest in it. And when a crisis happens, you increase the finance, increase the outreach, and you start delivering. But to try to come up with patchwork of responses, that's not the best answer. So systematically, we need to think, to innovate in terms of policies, public policies, but also joint public-private partnerships in this, supporting this very delicate process of school-to-work transition, and in particular during the crisis that unfortunately will happen again and again. Hopefully with not this magnitude and impact, but it's part of the sort of life in education and in labor markets.
Thank you so much for those comments, and I agree. I do hope we never see something of this scale again. But would anyone else like to follow on from those points? Zita raised some really interesting ideas that maybe someone wants to kind of jump on and expand a little bit about your own thoughts on the subject. Oh, Nader, are you trying to say something? Oh, please, Golo, go ahead.
Just one thought. Although it's Youth Skills Day, the crisis was not a skills crisis. So it's not because of skill that it's not the lack of youth skills that led to this crisis. And I think that we need to keep that in mind. Skills are really, really helpful to navigate this situation. A really good. Not just skills to do a job, but to get a job, to maintain a job, to navigate this transition, and to actually look for opportunities and develop the skills is really important. But and I think Azita was touching on that as well, and that we need systems that kick in when young people are facing such a situation such as this that has nothing to do with their own endowment, that cannot be fixed cannot just simply be fixed by upskilling some. It needs to be a more systematic approach to this.
No, thank you. And I totally agree. I think there is nowadays a lot of pressure that it's the individual themselves who aren't trained enough or don't have enough skills or enough education, and that they need to acquire more in order to be able to find a job. But as you were just mentioning, I think there are definitely systematic and systemic issues in place that are preventing that rather than the individual himself. Please, Nader, you wanted to say something?
I mean, yes, I'm reflecting on Azita's idea points and Muhammad. So to some extent, you need in a crisis, you need several things to kind of be in place and work together. And Azita made a very, very important point. The institutions need to be in place ahead of time. I mean, once a crisis hits, you have what you have. I mean, whatever car you're driving is what you're going to be driving. But you also need the skills in place. So that's part of it, but it's different. It's looking at not just institutions, but individuals. So young people need to be ready, need to have some experience. And as was mentioned, I mean, need to have experienced some form of either engaging in work or internships or something like that. So they're kind of ready for this. And the third point that gets to a little bit what Muhammad said is you kind of, besides institutions, individuals, you need an enabling environment. So let's say you have some institutions in place and you have individuals who are trained in entrepreneurship and they have an entrepreneurship mindset. You need the space to be able to do things, which goes beyond institutions, beyond having the mechanics in place. You need leadership that allows people to experiment, to start new businesses without stopping them, to engage with new opportunities without saying, why are you doing that, and who gave you the authority to do that. So you need the kind of a regulatory, more than that even, norms from everything from regulations to policymakers to families to other big businesses who look on entrepreneurs as potential competitive threats down the line, to have a different attitude towards this. So you need at least 3 levels kind of working together for this to basically deal with crises when they hit in an effective way.
Thank you for those comments. Cher, would you like to jump on and address this?
Yeah, well, we're touching on some really important issues, and they all deserve actually a lot of further discussion. But obviously, for the sake of time, I just want to focus on this aspect that skills are not enough, right? I mean, we all agree that skilling is absolutely essential, and there's really critical issues around access, and this, as Nader has pointed out, has been exacerbated by this crisis. But ultimately, especially if you're looking at developing countries, the situation prior to the crisis, to this crisis, and what's likely to happen in the coming years, and we all know the recovery is going to be slow. It's going to, young people will face, this issue of scarring effects has been noted, etc. But so what really needs to be thought about and focused on much more is where the jobs are going to come from, right? Unless we're creating jobs, then skilling is not going to really lead to the outcomes that young people are looking for. I mean, Nader gave the example of Egypt. there has been a preference for public sector jobs, and there is no alternative in the private sector that are attractive for young people and in line with their aspirations. So what is absolutely critical is we look at how young people can benefit, and this is needs to be a key priority for policymakers in terms of the overall policy setting on the demand side. So particularly looking at the sectors as they recover, what type of incentives are being provided to those sectors. Many countries are providing hiring subsidies. We've been reviewing that here at the ILO just recently. How much of that is for youth? Quite a bit is for youth, but often it's not sufficient. They're often set at very low levels. So, really taking that more integrated look at both the demand and supply to ensure that, the improvements on the skilling side, fully agree with Mohammed about encouraging the entrepreneurship, but really we have to see that translating also, in terms of policy action into investment and jobs. And until that happens, we're somehow, we're missing, the outcomes that young people need. So I would just put that out. It may be a little provocative, but I think, unless we have jobs, skilling will achieve the goals on their own.
No, I totally agree. And I think it's really important also, you kind of mentioned thinking ahead and preparing for the next generation of young people as well. So I think all of these points are really important, and it does bring up this wider discussion about all of the different things that need to be in place for young people, not even just one generation because of the crisis, but multiple generations going forward. So I guess in thinking about all of this and thinking specifically about this crisis and how reliant it was on technology and being able to remote work, obviously in very specific sectors and in very specific parts of the country, but moving forward, how do you think technology is going to impact youth employment going forward, and how can young people take advantage of perhaps being more technologically savvy, just as a whole generation, or do you think that there will be a shift back towards more, I guess, traditional working, I'm going to say, away from technology? And also, as an aside from that, people were mentioning the digital divide and the inequality that is being brought around by remote working and technology. So I guess I just wanted to hear everyone's thoughts about these two conflicting ideas about technology being here to stay, and how young people can harness it in an equal and equitable way worldwide. So I'll just toss that out there if anyone would like to start off.
If I may just venture, I think Golo rightly brought up the issue of psychosocial impact of this crisis compared to the previous that we see more pronounced amongst youth. And the only digital environment that the most privileged amongst the youth had even access to did not work very well in terms of psychosocial impact. So yes, as you rightly said, Tess, this is a bit of a contradicting statement. They are savvier, they are more inclined to get into new technologies and to harness them and to use them. But at the same time, the only digital environment cuts them off from everybody, but including it had devastating impact on youth from social interactions, in-person interactions that are very important for the type of skills that Mohammed Shah mentioned in terms of emotional skills, coping strategies, resilience, etc. So I really think that, harnessing the digital skills or digital environment, digital type of work within a broader social interaction. But a point that probably we didn't emphasize enough is, and actually that was the case for the first 2007-8 crisis, is that the youth employment crisis, or the crisis, pre-existing crisis to the crisis, wasn't just a question of lack of jobs, but it's about quality of jobs. So when we are saying school to work transition, it's not any work, temporary, low pay, that will stay with them. So the question is really a question of the crisis of decent jobs or good quality jobs, and this transition to some stability, security in job tenure for young people. They treasure that more than anything. And obviously, yes, they are the some of the technologies that we are seeing can open up new opportunities, like without going into blockchain technology, for instance, but also we see that the digital labor platforms are not necessarily providing for the time being job opportunities of quality. No, they are reproducing the same biases in real labor markets, the same type of vulnerabilities that we are seeing, although they are providing more opportunities for young people. So I really think that we shouldn't be kind of dazzled by technology. We should be looking at the positive side of it, but also very cautious about the side effects of the same technologies in terms of impact on access, equalities, but also quality of jobs.
You make some really interesting points there, and I think it is important to distinguish, a job from a decent job, and that matches skill sets and that will provide a good way of life for people. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's a really important point. Would anyone else like to follow up with their thoughts? Yes, please, Nader.
There's several layers to technology. One is just basically the use of technology, and I think parts of the world that are, and it's coming. So let's just be clear: technology is happening, it's coming. You have more digital platforms, you have more automation, you have AI. So the disruption is actually here. So areas where there are difficulties of young people in terms of potentially access in some parts of the world. Are they able to access platforms? Do they have enough access to broadband, the kind of internet that will allow them to access? So take a place like Syria, devastated by civil war. Okay, you say, well, young people maybe have some technological skills, they can go online, they do freelance. How are they going to do freelance? First of all, you have sanctions that if you try to access Upwork from Syria, you can't. Even through proxy server, it's not going to let you. Let's say you can access a platform. Well, then you have electricity shutting off, most of the day. Syria or Lebanon, pick a country, that's going through these things. How are you going to get transfers of payments? Nothing's allowed in many of these countries that are either severely underdeveloped, experiencing conflict, or things like that. So and finally, skills. So we looked at coding people at one point in time, people who are doing coding work as freelancers on Odesk before they became Upwork, and they had good technical skills. The main problem they were having in terms of low ratings was delivering the work on time, communication with the client, all these soft skills that they didn't have. That's what was actually causing them to have low ratings. So you have a whole bunch of things. So technology holds a lot of promise, but for many of these countries that are struggling to emerge from underdevelopment or conflict or something like that, and young people who are trying to survive in these difficult environments, it's very difficult to access and use, and they lack the skills to be able to do so effectively. So, but it still holds a lot of promise. The question that we need to ask is, as scholars, international organizations, is how can we remove some of these barriers and create a more enabling environment, despite all these hurdles that are institutionally built into preventing some of these young people from being able to access technology and use it effectively.
Thank you. That's a great point. Cher, would you like to carry on from that?
Well, yeah, sure. Thanks. I think both Azita and Nader have pointed out quite a bit what I wanted to say. Obviously there's a lot of promise. There are also challenges, and indeed this access issue is something I wanted to stress. And ultimately, we have to see technology as a policy choice, right? I mean, it's not just something that is happening. Yes, it has happened rapidly around us, but one thing that we need to work, in terms of working with countries, is to see technology as within policies that address youth employment in terms of access issues, and ultimately also regulatory issues. As Azita pointed out on the platform economy, I mean, it really tells us a lot at the moment. There are many opportunities in the platform economy, but there are many gaps in terms of decent work, which leads towards big questions around regulation, and that's something that's going to keep us occupied particularly the ILO, but also globally for the coming years. How do we regulate better the digital platform economy? But, so the bottom line is, how do we actually see this as a policy choice, and how can policy shape technology adoption, improve access, and those outcomes in terms of access to decent and productive employment? So.
No, thank you. And I don't envy your job at trying to regulate the market there. Mohammed, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, just Nadir said what I wanted to say, that access to internet and the platforms, like for example, Pakistan stands fourth in the world in terms of freelance developers. India, our neighboring country, they produce the most number of freelancers. On the other side, Afghanistan, where there is no internet access, where there are no digital platforms, no payment gateways. I mean, the youth there are probably that youth is hit the hardest. So again, there should equitable access to digital platforms, internet especially. This need to be thought out by the governments at a larger scales, and payment gateways. I mean again, a lot of issues. Pakistan, despite being the fourth largest country who produce freelancers, there are still the youth still struggle with payment gateways because a lot of PayPal access is denied in Pakistan. Again, Amazon has just recently, a couple of months back, have started operations in Pakistan. So these things are important. Again, the skills are there. People are willing to work online, but and again, within countries, there are regions where a lot of regions within one country, they differ in terms of having access to internet and having access to digital payment gateways. So these are the policy matters that need to be thought upon. And I think it's the future will in the future, digital literacy will gain a lot, and freelancing will gain a lot of traction. But countries need to see it from every angle and make policies accordingly.
Thank you for that addition. And I do think it's important. It draws back to the bigger comment that there is no one-fits-all solution to this problem, and that there are so many nuances, as everyone has said, within and between countries. And just because one solution for young people works specifically for one country or one subsection or one city or two people doesn't necessarily mean that it will translate. And I think that's what makes this question of youth employment so difficult, because it changes every day and the demographics are changing every day, and it does make it an incredibly nuanced and difficult area to discuss. So I really appreciate everyone's comments there. And I just like to address Golub just quickly with one final comment, I think, because we're getting to the end of our time, because you mentioned about the mental health of young people who are job searching and who are in isolation and in this crisis. And I know a lot of people are feeling that way, and a lot of our audience, I'm sure, will be feeling that way too. So I just wondered what you think can be done to address the impact that specifically the employment crisis is having on young people and their desire for a job and the struggle that they are going through, most of the time isolated. So I was wondering if you had any insights there for us.
I mean, that of course raises the question of what support services are around and are available for young people. Can they turn to friends and family or partners? What are the professional support services? What stigma is attached with going and acknowledging mental health problems? That's something. Mental health literacy, talking about skills, is an issue in some cases where people actually struggle to. You need to self-diagnose to some extent what the situation is before you can seek out help. So yeah, there's of course a great deal of discussion going on. what services are available, what support you can draw on, and this and again, it's spotty and different. There are services available for students, for pupils but what about people in the transition into the labor market who've left education systems who may have had a mental health support worker? Where do they go? Do they need to go straight away to their GP? Who can they talk to? So sometimes it's signposting, but it's an important issue. Yeah, how to reach out, how to know when to reach out, and so forth. Very, very relevant. Yes.
Definitely, and thank you for that. And I guess, would anyone like to say anything just to sum up their thoughts about young people who are maybe in this crisis and who are feeling lost and struggling with the youth employment crisis due to the impact of the pandemic? Is there hope for the future? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Is there anything that people want to say to end on a more solution-focused or forward-looking note? Because I know we've touched on some things, but I always like to end on a positive note with these things. So if anyone has anything to say to reassure people who maybe are in the position. Azita?
Yes, I would say that while COVID-19 has had massive impact and negative impact on many aspects of our lives and jobs and work environment, however, it has also created, and that's the positive note, a new momentum for rethinking policy change. Some of those ideas that were seen like more radical or revolutionary or marginal have come to the fore as central ideas. Why not? Let us consider them. Would have been more resilient to the crisis had we had these institutions in place or these ideas. So I really think that also focusing on youth, there is a much how would I say, boiling pot of ideas and initiatives that need to be expressed, that need to be debated. So let us take those, let us engage youth agencies in discussing what worked for them, what types of support they initiated or they had access to that made a difference, and what was missing. And through this discussion, come up with more systematic ideas about institutions, as Goro was saying, because we have educational and skilling institutions on the one hand, and we have labor market institutions looking after the unemployed or when they exist, obviously. But this transition in between and this connection, we really need to rethink the sort of the automatic stabilizers. This is a jargon we use a lot in terms of response to crisis when something like that. And I really think that the positive impact of this crisis is this rethinking, innovating, and coming up with some ideas which may be considered bold or impractical, but they are worth, and massive investment by public policies, but also the private sector should be forthcoming more than they have done in this crisis.
No, that's fantastic. And I totally agree. I do see this kind of renewed energy for people, especially as, things in certain countries are starting to look a little better and we have a vaccine and we need to just now buckle down and distribute it to everyone. And I think hopefully this will push some really innovative and new ideas to the forefront. So that would be great. I totally agree. Would anyone else like to say anything before we sum up and I wrap the session up? Yes, please go ahead, Nader.
Yes, I think, addressing young people, I think the idea, if you're in school or even recently out of school looking for a job, go look, talk to people. And it's not just about applying for jobs. It's about having conversations. It's about seeing somebody who you think you might want to be like 10 years from now and saying, can I invite you to a cup of coffee and just talk? Mohammed mentioned an entrepreneurial mindset. That doesn't just apply to simply starting a business. It applies to kind of your career and thinking about. So, the young people in transition, it's a time for exploring, asking questions, read. And many people in this region, at least, when they say I'm looking for a job or I can't find anything, my question is, well, who did you talk to? Nobody. I submitted my CV. Go talk to people. Did you read a book? What's your career? Geography. Did you read a book outside your curriculum on geography? No. Well, how do you know the most recent things that are coming up in this field? So, you know, find out about your career, find out about your field, get the knowledge, and then slowly build contacts and explore opportunities. That's what it's all about, and it's fun and it's exciting, and it should be that time of your life. And we put so much expectations on young people in terms of, you got to go get a job, you got to get a decent job. Fine, get an internship first and build up to a decent job. It's okay, but just be active. And I think that's the key message here. There's a lot of opportunities out there.
No, I totally agree. And I think it's important to remind everyone that, you know, you should maybe take out the pressure. Some of this stuff should be fun. It shouldn't all be as stressful. And I know it is stressful for most people, but, you know, you should want to do things that you're passionate about and you're interested in. And hopefully that is the case for people. So no, I appreciate those comments. Mohammed, would you like to finish off? Oh, you're muted, sorry.
It is, sorry, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, I would just like to add to what Nader pointed out. This pandemic has given birth to a lot of new industries also. So the positive thing is that, especially when we talk about startups and small businesses, they have learned through this pandemic that they can pivot quickly to take advantages of opportunities when the growth is slowing. And in the early years of rapid growth, you know, they can go to uncharted waters and explore new opportunities. Zoom is a very good example, for example. During this pandemic, they have earned billions and billions of dollars. So, and out of our startups that we mentor here at this university, Butams, a lot of new gadgets and products were developed by the youngsters, young students and scientists, which were particularly diagnosing COVID, for example, and all other COVID pandemic-related diseases. So I think human capacity is really immense. Challenges will add to their creativity, provided that they have the entrepreneurial mindset.
Thank you very much for those positive comments to finish us off. And I think all that's left for me to say is a massive thank you to our panelists for being here with me today, this morning or this afternoon or this evening. Your insights and your comments have been incredibly interesting, and I know I am going away feeling much more inspired about my own youth employment situation, and so I'm sure everyone else will be too. Thank you so much to our audience as well for participating. There will be a recap of the webinar published in the coming weeks, so that if people have missed it, then that will be available. And we also ask that people take our short survey that has been projected just here to let us know how you felt about this webinar. So thank you very much, everyone, again. I really appreciate everyone's time, and I hope you have a good rest of your day, wherever you may be. Thank you very much.